10-Minute Murder contains depictions of actual crimes. What you are about to hear is real and violent in nature. Discretion is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, the brief and bingeable true crime podcast, which is not brief right now. We're not doing brief episodes with this Ted Bundy special. And by the way, this is part 2 of the Ted Bundy special, and I'm Joe, the host. Thanks for being here. In part 1, you heard all about his early life, how Ted grew up, what he was like as a teen, relationships, and how he had 2 completely different faces. If you haven't listened to the first part yet, go back and listen. It builds the framework for Bundy as a person, giving you an insight into his effortless manipulation of the people around him, how his contacts at the Washington Republican Party helped to pave the way to law school for Ted, and how he toyed with the lady as revenge for her breaking up with him. Women seemed to gravitate toward him, which wasn't necessarily the case when he was younger. Ted knew the effect he could have on the people around him, and he used it to his advantage in the most vile way. Now, let's talk about the sadistic monster that used his charm and good looks to lure women to rape, murder, and mutilate. This is Ted Bundy, Part 2. No one really knows for sure exactly when Ted Bundy began killing women. I mentioned in Part 1 that Ted would often tell conflicting stories just as easily as you and I would breathe air. He told different people different things about when it all began. But there is a strong reason to believe that when Bundy was just 14 years old, he kidnapped and killed 8-year-old Anne Marie Burr in Tacoma, Washington. On August 31st, 1961, Anne's mother, Beverly, woke up early, as she had a habit of doing, checked on her 4 kids, and found Anne's bed empty. Nothing else looked out of place otherwise, just that she was gone. She noticed that the living room window was open and a bench she had in the garden was moved to just below the window. A shoe print left on the bench outside was about the size of a teenager's foot. Beverly called the police to help, and she went door to door in the neighborhood searching for her daughter. And I know you're wondering, was young Ted Bundy a neighbor of Anne? Yes. In fact, Ted was a paper boy in the area, and his uncle lived very close by, and Ted often visited him. A couple witnesses also claimed that on several occasions, they actually saw Anne helping Ted with his newspapers. A big obstacle with the disappearance of Anne is that the University of Puget Sound campus had 7 buildings under construction at that time, and that construction site was nearby where Anne lived and where Ted lived. Anne's father put 2 and 2 together and prompted police to go take a look. Anne's brother had seen a teenage boy there kicking dirt into a ditch. It took a few days before the police sent anyone out to investigate, and by that time, the area had been all paved over. Now, I'm not saying that Ted Bundy was that teenage boy. I'm not saying he for sure kidnapped and killed Anne. I'm saying that when Ted Bundy later had a choice of colleges to attend, he chose this same one. Twice. And it's super suspicious. Adult Ted Bundy denied having anything to do with the disappearance of Anne Marie Burr, for the record.
Do you remember what pushed you over that edge?
Again, when you say pushed, I know what you're saying. I don't want to infer again.
I understand that.
That I was some helpless kind of a victim, and yet we're talking about an influence that is the influence of violent types of media and violent pornography, which was an indispensable link in the chain of behavior, the chain of events that led to the behaviors, to the assaults, to the murders, and what have you. It's a very difficult thing to describe. The sensation of reaching that point where I knew that it was like something had, say, snapped, that I knew that I couldn't control it anymore, that these barriers that I had learned as a child, that had been instilled in me, were not enough to hold me back with respect to seeking out and harming somebody.
Would it be accurate to call that a frenzy, a sexual frenzy?
Well, yes, that's one way to describe it. A compulsion, a building up of this destructive energy. Another factor here that I haven't mentioned is the use of alcohol. But I think that what alcohol did, in conjunction with, let's say, my exposure to pornography, was alcohol reduced my inhibitions. At the same time, the fantasy life that was fueled by pornography eroded them further.
In the early days, you were nearly always about half drunk when you did these things. Is that right?
Yes.
Was that always true?
I would say that was generally the case, almost without exception.
All right, if I can understand it now, there's this battle going on within. There are the conventions that you've been taught. There's the right and wrong that you learned as a child. Mm-hmm. And then there is this unbridled passion fueled by your plunge into hardcore violent pornography. And those things are at war with each other.
Yes.
And then with the alcohol diminishing the inhibitions, you let go.
Well, yes, and you can summarize it that way, and that's accurate, certainly. And it just occurred to me that some people would say that, well, I've seen that stuff and it doesn't do anything to me. And I can understand that. Virtually everyone can be exposed to so-called pornography, and while they're aroused to it to one degree or another, not go out and do anything wrong.
Addictions are like that. They affect some people more than they affect others. Well, but there is a percentage of people affected by hardcore pornography in a very violent way, and you're obviously one of them.
That was a major component, and I don't know why I was vulnerable to it. All I know is that it had an impact on me that was just so central to the development of the violent behavior that I engaged in.
Ted, after you committed your first murder, what was the emotional effect on you? What happened in the days after that?
Well, again, please understand that even all these years later, it's very difficult to talk about it, and reliving it through talking about it is difficult, to say the least. But I want you to understand what happened. It was like coming out of some kind of horrible trance or dream. I can only liken it to after, I don't want to over-dramatize it, but to have been possessed by something so awful and so alien, and then the next morning wake up from it, remember what happened, and realize that basically, in the eyes of the law, certainly in the eyes of God, you're responsible. To wake up in the morning and realize what I had done, and with a clear mind and all my essential moral and ethical feelings intact at that moment, absolutely horrified that I was capable of doing something like that.
You really hadn't known that before?
There is just absolutely no way to describe, first, the brutal urge to do that kind of thing, and then what happens is once it has been more or less satisfied and recedes, you might say, or spent, that sense, that kind of energy level recedes, and basically I became myself again. And I want people to understand this too, and I'm not saying this gratuitously because it's important people understand this, that basically I was a normal person. I wasn't some guy hanging out at bars or a bum or I wasn't a pervert in the sense that, you know, people look at somebody and say, I know there's something wrong with him, and just tell. I mean, I was essentially a normal person. I had good friends. I led a normal life, except for this one small but very potent and very destructive segment of it that I kept very secret and very close to myself and didn't let anybody know about it. And part of the shock and horror from my dear friends and family years ago when I was first arrested was that there was no clue. They looked at me and they looked at the all-American boy. And I mean, I wasn't perfect, but I want to be quite candid with you. I was okay. Okay, I was. The basic humanity and basic spirit that God gave me was intact, but unfortunately it became overwhelmed at times. And I think people need to recognize that it's not some kind of those of us who have been so much influenced by violence in the media, in particular pornographic violence, are not some kinds of inherent monsters. We are your sons and we are your husbands. And we grew up in regular families, and pornography can reach out and snatch a kid out of any house today. It snatched me out of my home. It snatched me out of my home 20, 30 years ago. And as diligent as my parents were, and they were diligent in protecting their children, and as good a Christian home as we had, and we had a wonderful Christian home, there is no protection against the kinds of influences that are loose in a society that tolerates.
You feel this really deeply, don't you? Ted, outside these walls right now, there are several hundred reporters that wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
And you asked me to come here from California because you had something you wanted to say. This hour that we have together is not just an interview with a man who's scheduled to die tomorrow morning. I'm here and you're here because of this message that you're talking about right here. You really feel that hardcore pornography and the doorway to it, softcore pornography, is doing untold damage to other people and causing other women to be abused and killed the way you did others.
Listen, I'm no social scientist, and I haven't done a survey. I mean, I don't pretend that I know what John Q. Citizen thinks about this. But I've lived in prison for a long time now. And I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence just like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography, without question, without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction to pornography. There's no question about it. The FBI's own study on serial homicide shows that the most common interest among serial killers is pornography.
That's true.
And it's real. It's true.
Ted, what would your life have been like without that influence? You can only speculate.
Yeah. Well, I know it would have been far better, not just for me, and it's, excuse me for being so self-centered here. It would have been a lot better for me and lots of other people. I know that, lots of other innocent people, victims and families. It would have been a lot better. There's no question, but it would have been a fuller life. Certainly a life that would not have involved, I'm absolutely certain, would not have involved this kind of violence that I have committed.
I'm sure, Ted, if I were able to ask you the questions that are being asked out there, one of the most important as you come down to perhaps your final hours, are you thinking about all those victims out there and their families who are so wounded, years later, their lives have not returned to normal. They will never return to normal.
Absolutely.
Are you carrying that load, that weight? Is the remorse there?
Again, I know that people will accuse me of being self-serving, but we're beyond that now. I mean, I'm just telling you how I feel. But through God's help, I have been able to come to the point where much too late, but better late than never, feel the hurt and the pain that I am responsible for. Yes, absolutely. In the past few days, myself and a number of investigators have been talking about unsolved cases, murders that I was involved in. And it's hard to talk about all these years later because it revives in me all those terrible feelings and those thoughts that I have steadfastly and diligently dealt with, and I think successfully, with the love of God. And yet it's reopened that, and I felt the pain and I felt the horror again of all that. And I can only hope that those who I have harmed, even if they don't believe my expression of sorrow and remorse, will believe what I'm saying now, that there is loose in their towns and their communities people like me today whose dangerous impulses are being fueled day in and day out by violence in the media in its various forms, particularly sexualized violence.
Even though there's more speculation about when and where Bundy began killing women, let's fast forward to 1974, the first confirmed and confessed crimes. Around the same time, Ted ended the relationship with Stephanie Brooks, the one he ghosted. A little after midnight on January 4th, he snuck into the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks, who was a dancer at UW. Bundy used a metal rod from her bed frame to beat her unconscious. He then used that same metal rod to sexually assault her, causing massive internal injuries. For 10 days, she remained unconscious in a hospital, but survived with permanent physical and mental disabilities. That kicked off Ted's murderous rampage across Washington and Oregon. He later confessed to 36 killings, but investigators believe that number is probably closer to 100. Stories circulated about a dark-haired, nice-looking young man calling himself Ted being the last person seen with many of the victims. He was luring women by asking for help. Bundy would often wear an arm sling and pretend to be injured, carrying books in need of help getting to his car, which was a brown Volkswagen Beetle. The kindness of these women was rewarded with being raped, tortured, and killed. Women were disappearing by the rate of about one per month. Police concern was growing by the day. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common apart from being young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted down the middle. During this period, Bundy was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, where he wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Later, he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, a state government agency involved in the search for missing women. At DES, he met and dated Carol Ann Boone, a twice-divorced mother of two, who 6 years later would play an important role in the final phase of his life. Reports of 6 missing women and Sparks' brutal beating appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. Fear spread among the population. Hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply. Pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies, but the lack of physical evidence severely hampered them. Police couldn't provide the reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. Further similarities between the victims were noted. Disappearances all took place at night, usually near ongoing construction work, within a week of midterm or final exams. All victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans, and at most crime scenes, there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. The Pacific Northwest murders culminated on July 14th, with the broad daylight abductions of 2 women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park. 5 female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a slight accent, maybe Canadian or British. Introducing himself as Ted, he asked for their help in unloading a sailboat from his brown-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 4 refused, but 1 followed him to his car, saw that there was no sailboat, and left. 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Ott, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court. Ted used the sailboat story, and they watched her leave the beach in his company. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslin, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. Bundy later confessed that Ott was still alive when he returned with Naslin, and that he forced one to watch as he murdered the other. King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Elizabeth Klepfer, Ann Rule, a DES employee, and a UW psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car, and reported Bundy as a possible suspect, but detectives, who were receiving up to 200 tips per day, thought it was unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the killer. In August 1974, Bundy was accepted into the University of Utah School of Law and moved to Salt Lake City. He still stayed in contact with Liz, but was freely dating whomever he wanted to. While in his first semester, he realized that the other students were seemingly smarter and were able to grasp the course material much easier than Ted. He was really disappointed and frustrated. The following month, women started disappearing, turning up dead. Again, but in a new place. Many of these murders remained unsolved until Bundy's pre-execution confession. Some of the bodies have still never been found. Like an Idaho hitchhiker, Ted picked her up, raped her, strangled her, and dumped her body in a nearby river. The next day, he returned to rape her again, photograph, and dismember her body. 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox went missing in Salt Lake City. He says he buried her remains near Capitol Reef National Park, but investigators were never able to find them. On October 18th, 17-year-old Melissa Ann Smith, the daughter of a Utah police chief, disappeared as she left a pizza parlor. 9 days later, her body was found. She appeared to have been left alive for up to 7 days before Bundy killed her and left her body. On October 31st, Laura Ann Amy, also 17, disappeared after leaving a cafe just after midnight. Hikers out for a Thanksgiving Day walk found her naked body in American Fork Canyon. Both Smith and Amy had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. Bundy also said that after they died, he shampooed their hair and put makeup on them. The count of murdered women started adding up, and it was making national news. Liz, back home in Washington, noticed. She called King County Police again after already tipping them off about her boyfriend once before, when he looked exactly like the police sketch. She told them that Ted had moved, and now women were disappearing in the exact area he had moved to. They brought her in for an interview, but told her that even though he was still a suspect, their most credible witness from the lake incidents failed to identify Ted in a police lineup. Liz then called the Salt Lake City Police herself that December and told them everything she knew and about her suspicions. They added Bundy to their list of suspects, but had no actual evidence against him. The very next month, Ted returned to Seattle to visit and spent a week with her. She obviously said nothing to Ted about her secret super sleuthing and phone calls to tip off police departments in 2 different states, and about what she thought he was doing. When Ted left, Liz told Ted that she would be flying in to see him in Salt Lake City that summer. Apparently feeling like it was a little too risky to continue killing in Utah, Bundy ventured out to Colorado. Starting as soon as he got back from his visit in Seattle, and for the next few months, he killed about a half dozen people, including 12-year-old Lynette Culver. He kidnapped her outside her middle school. He took her to his hotel room where he drowned Lynette, then sexually assaulted her dead body. When he was finished, he dumped her body in Snake River. That May, several of his former co-workers from Washington came for a visit and spent a week in his apartment, including former girlfriend Carol Ann Boone. He was a good host, and they never suspected anything. In June, Ted went back to Seattle and spent another week with Liz. They discussed getting married the following Christmas. They were both hiding information from each other. Liz didn't tell him that she was pretty sure he was a serial killer and had reported him multiple times, and he didn't tell her that he was seeing and sleeping with a handful of other women and was also moonlighting as one of the most cunning and vicious serial killers in American history. When he got back to Utah, the next person he killed, Susan Curtis, was the last person he confessed to killing right before he entered the execution chamber in 1989. Her body was never recovered. In late 1975, Ted Bundy was baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He wasn't an active participant and ignored most of the church's restrictions, including sexual relations outside of marriage, hot drinks with caffeine, and murder. When Bundy was arrested for kidnapping in 1976, the church excommunicated him. Later on, when Bundy was asked what his religious preference was, he said Methodist, which is the religion of his childhood. And before any possible LDS members get mad because I mentioned that notorious serial killer Ted Bundy had once been a member of their church, I also mentioned that he identified himself as a Methodist, which is the exact religion that I am. So maybe chill out. Meanwhile, back in the Pacific Northwest, investigators were scratching their heads, trying to figure out how and why the murder spree that had been going on in that area ended so abruptly. In a move that was innovative at the time, but today is super standard, they entered the mass amounts of data on the cases into a database. They used the payroll computer because at the time, they were expensive and they didn't have one of their own. After inputting the many lists they had compiled, classmates and acquaintances of each victim, Volkswagen owners named Ted, known sex offenders, and so on, they queried the computer for coincidences. Out of thousands of names, 26 turned up on 4 lists. One was Ted Bundy. Detectives also manually compiled a list of their 100 best suspects, and Bundy was on that list as well. He was literally at the top of the pile of suspects when the word came from Utah of his arrest. That's the episode for today, and obviously this is going to be more than 2 parts. I'm trying my best not to make the episode super long, and obviously nowhere near 10 minutes, but I'm making an effort to keep them concise but still interesting. In the next part, we'll pick up with Ted Bundy after he's arrested in 1975 for kidnapping. And that arrest kicks off a whole slew of craziness, including escapes from prison, murders in Florida, just about being released free in Florida after being captured, and his multiple murder trials. Thanks for listening to 10 Minute Murder. Have a good night.